Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University in the Perception Action Podcast. And what I want to do in this presentation is to talk about applying an ecological approach to volleyball practice, design, and coaching. And I'm going to actually do this in two parts. In this first part, I want to lay out kind of the ecological approach, the basic fundamentals of it, talk about some of the theory, and then get into a little bit of the research that I think supports these ideas of this alternative ecological approach. In the second presentation, which you'll be able to find in a different post, I will be get into a little more of the practice design issues and talk about some specifics of how we can change how we run practices and research examining practice design in volleyball. So this is all kind of an extension of my new book, How We Learn to Move. So taking some of these fundamental ideas that I presented in the book and applying it specifically to volleyball. So what I want to start with, and the way that I usually start, I want to contrast the two main theoretical approaches to skill acquisition by focusing on the way that I like to focus on is the role of variability. Right. So when we talk about variability, it's critical figure out what kind we're talking about, right? So I like to distinguish three different types of variability, right? There's variability in the performance outcome, right? Where the ball goes, how hard you hit it. There's variability in the movements that create that outcome, how much you bend your arm, how much your elbow rotates. And then there's variability in the practice conditions that a coach creates, right? So they all influence each other. And fundamentally, the two different approaches to skill vary in how they treat these things, right? The traditional kind of repetition based approach is the idea that there's one correct technique, right? So there's one correct way to do an overhand serve in volleyball. The way that we teach it to someone is by instructing them prescriptively. Here's what you do with your arm. Here's where you put your hand, having them practice it over and over in rote repetition. We correct them when they're wrong. Okay. So when they do something different. And the fundamental assumption there is that movement variability is bad, right? Any inconsistency in how much you bend your elbow or flex your wrist when you're serving is just noise that we want to get rid of. And really, that's one of the main goals of repetition, right? Repetition is designed to lower the variability of your movements, right? So if we're going to contrast this in my relationship, right, in this three types of variability, the idea is the outcome, the variability and outcome we want to be low. That's true in every theory, right? We want you to consistently hit the target where you're aiming your serve. Consistently place it, if you're right back corner, that's where you're aiming. We want a consistent outcome. In the traditional approach, the assumption is that you get repeatable outcomes through repeatable movements, right? The way that I consistently hit my target is by trying to move exactly the same way every time, right? So using the same amount of position of body, same amount of elbow flexion, so on. What this leads us to do is typically we start focusing on mechanics or fundamentals in practice, right? So we're going to teach you, for example, how to toss the ball separately from how to hit it, right? Because we want the ball toss to be exactly in a certain way, right? So the idea here is that low outcome variability is produced by low movement variability, which was developed by relatively low practice variability. I want you to do the same thing over and over, break it apart, and so on. When we add variability later on, the purpose of it is what I call adjustability, right? So what we want you to do in this traditional view is learn the one correct technique, the motor program for serving, right? Learn that through repetition. Then you're going to learn how to reparameterize it and vary it for specific conditions, right? So we'll teach you how to serve in the middle back. Now you have to learn how to serve, do a short serve. What do you need to change about your movement to produce a short serve, right? So we want you to have repetition with repetition, be able to repeat the outcome by repeating the movement, despite the fact that conditions are varying, right? Despite the fact that you want you to serve to a different place, we want you to serve in the wind, it's outside, right? So you're learning to parameterize a motor program. You're learning to adjust this one. So we teach you the fundamental movement, and you learn to adjust it for specific conditions you might face in the volleyball environment. Okay. This means that, we're going to add variability of practice relatively late, right? And this is my baseball example, the main sport I work in. We're going to teach you the fundamentals first, the correct swing by hitting off a tee, get you to learn how to repeat it through repetition and correction. Once you get to repeat it, then we're going to add variability of specific conditions representative conditions. So in golf, we'll teach you how to swing on a flat ground. Later on, we'll add different lies to teach you how to adjust and reparameterize your motor program, right? So variability is for adjustability. It comes later on. That's the fundamental idea. Another fundamental idea we've already kind of touched on within this traditional approach is the idea of task decomposition, right? The way that we're going to get you to learn the one correct technique, the fundamentals, is by breaking the skill apart, right? And the classic example is doing the toss on the serve without swinging, right? We're trying to reduce the attentional demands. We're trying to, everyone recognizes that with a new learner, you need to make the skill easier in some way. You can't throw them into the, trying to do a full jump serve in a game before you train for a while. But the idea in the traditional approach is the way that we make things simpler is by breaking them apart, right? So here we're tossing without actually acting on the ball, right? So we've broken the skill apart into pieces. So once you get the toss down, you get to the right height and the right trajectory, then we're going to add in the swing of the arm to hit it, right? So we're breaking the skill apart, then putting it back together. That's the fundamental idea. So what's the alternative, right? What's the alternative? The alternative really coming from the work of Nikolai Bernstein and Gibson and all these Newell is the idea that there's no one ideal technique, right? We don't be skillful by repeating our movement. We do what Bernstein called repetition without repetition. We need to have some variability in our movement, so it's not just bad noise we want to get rid of. We need to vary our movement to adjust to the varying conditions, adapt to the varying changes and constraints is the word we're going to use. So we're going to do less correction. We're going to let the athlete explore and find their own solutions, right? So if we go to my variability diagram again, we want the same outcomes, right? We want consistent outcomes, low variability outcomes. As I said, that's part of every theory. We want you to consistently put the ball where you're aiming. But the idea is you don't achieve that by using the exact same body movements every time, right? Across individuals, we'll see different body movements. And within the same individual, there's going to be variations in the actual movement, right? If you're doing a jump serve, maybe you jump a little bit lower than last time, or you toss the ball a little bit further forward than last time, or the wind picks up, or you're fatigued, right? In order to repeat an outcome, we can't repeat the same movement because the conditions and the constraints are changing, right? So what we want to do in practice is instead of focusing on repetition, learning the one fundamental, we want to focus on adaptability. We want to focus on you learning to serve out of sand, put the ball in different places, get fatigued first and then serve with opponents there, right? So we're getting you to adapt. So the idea here is low outcome variability, which we want, requires a significant amount of movement variability. It doesn't come through a purely repeatable movement, which is developed by adding higher variability in practice. And as I said, in the second part of this, we'll look at some specific examples of that, right? So the purpose of variability in this new ecological view is not adjustability. It's not learning the fundamental, then adjusting it or reparameterizing a motor program later. It's adaptability. We want you to be able to explore and solve problems right from the start. We're learning to move. So we're getting repetition without repetition because of variation. In the traditional view, we're trying to learn this one fundamental and hold on to it despite the world changing around us. In the new view, we're accepting the world changes around us and accepting we can't have this one movement, right? And so this is a fundamentally different way to use variability, right? So both cases, variability is good. In the ecological approach, you want to add variability relatively early because you want the person to learn to problem solve and explore. Also, in this new approach, you don't necessarily have to have things varying that are going to vary in competition, right? You can use different size balls or make person jump off one foot or start with their hands out to their side, because what you're trying to teach the person to do is adapt and problem solve, not adjust to a specific variant that's going to occur in game, right? So it's totally okay to use weird things in practice. And I'll show you some examples of people that of the studies that have used these weird things. So we want variability early to encourage adaptability, right? And as a final example, this is one that I always like to use to show the difference between, in the traditional approach, we talked about task decomposition, making a task easier for a new learner by breaking it apart. In the ecological approach, we want to use task simplification, right? So instead of making soccer dribbling easier by having you do it around cones and no opponents, we use soccer tag, right? So it's soccer tag, you have one player trying to touch you while you're controlling the ball. So we've made it simpler, but critically, we haven't broken it apart, right? You're still dribbling a ball, you're still out facing an opponent, right? We've simplified it, we've scaled it down. And I'll show you some more examples of that specifically to volleyball as we go along. Okay. But before we get into that, I want to address one kind of more key theoretical issue that I think is important for understanding volleyball. That is, Bernstein's problem. Bernstein problem he identified. So if we accept this ecological approach that there's movement variability is good and there's more than one correct technique and there's more than one way to do it, now we've created another problem that Bernstein called the degrees of freedom problem. And it's the idea that, okay, we have lots of different ways we can move. How do we pick one, right? And degrees of freedom are kind of the options for moving, right? So when I move my elbow, I could have lots of different angles, rotate it in lots of different axes. All of those are degrees of freedom, right? How do I know when I'm doing a serve in volleyball what I'm supposed to be doing with my elbow? That's the essential degrees of freedom problem. How can, when we have so many different muscles, so this image is showing all the different degrees of freedom. So you have 3 degrees of freedom in your shoulder in terms of the directions it can rotate, which is actually controlled by 9 different muscles, right? So you have all these options. How do we control this system with so many different options is what Bernstein meant by his degree of freedom problem. And here's an example I like to use from article by Turvey and colleagues showing that even for something like throwing, right? So we're just using the upper body. If we just focus on the upper body, there's 26 different degrees of freedom. There's 26 different things you would have to specify in a motor program in order to get that to work, right? You'd have to tell the 10 muscles around the shoulder joint what each is doing, the 6 around the elbow, so on and so forth, right? So it's a very, very trying to exactly solve the degree of freedom problem by specifying everything. And that's the traditional view. The traditional view is that we're like a puppet, right? The brain is the puppeteer that tells each of the body parts what they should be doing through the motor program, right? So it's telling us how much the arm should bend, how much so there's the central controller to controlling everything, right? So each each degree of freedom has this independence. I like to liken it to, this comes from one of Turvey's ideas, it's like driving a car where each wheel could move completely independently. So imagine you had a car with 4 wheels, and each of them could move in any direction they want. There's no axles or anything. You have to control each of them by sitting in the middle with 4 steering wheels, right? That's really what we're asking our brain to do with a motor program, right? It's incredibly complicated. There has to be kind of a better way. And that's what Bernstein's view was. Bernstein's view was that instead of a central controller, a puppeteer trying to control everything, what we do is have the system self-organize. So the central controller gives some general constraints, right? There's some general constraints applied to the system, but the system self-organizes itself to solve these problems. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in a minute. Right. So we have, once we create an axle and the 2 wheels move together, we simplify the control problem in driving our car. Right. So this fundamental problem of degrees of freedom, let's talk a little bit about what Bernstein hypothesized how we do this. And I think this is very relevant to volleyball because I think you see a lot of examples of this. And when I talk about this, I actually like to use volleyball, even when I'm not doing a volleyball presentation, because I think it applies to a lot of these things. So Bernstein, how do we solve this degrees of freedom problem? How do we choose what each of our body parts and joints should be doing when we're doing something like a volleyball serve? Bernstein proposed that what we go through is kind of 3 stages. Initially, what we do is we solve the problem by using a very crude solution to simplify called freezing, right? And I'll show you an example. After we get some more practice, we stop doing that and we do what he called freeing, right? To add more degrees of freedom. And then once we get really advanced, we start exploiting and optimizing. So not just bringing in lots of degrees of freedom, using it in a way that's really efficient. Okay, so let's look at each of these. And as I said, in the specific case of volleyball. So stage 1 is freezing, right? That Bernstein proposed. This is where we constrain the available degrees of freedom. And well, this is something I'm going to talk about next time, obviously, when we talk about the constraints-led approach. But the reason we call it a constraint, right, is because a constraint is something that takes away some of the options for moving, right? It's constraining the solution. That's why we use this word. And one of the ways that we can do this is what Bernstein called freezing, right? And he saw that could come in two different types. One thing I could do, imagine I'm trying to serve, right? I'm coming up to a volleyball game that I have to serve. What should I be doing with my elbow? Well, one thing I could do that make the problem easier is not do anything with my elbow, right? I could lock my arm and my wrist and make my arm, just whole arm, rotate around my shoulder, right? So that I get the ball over the net, right? So what I've done is locked or fixed certain degrees of freedom so they're not actually used in the solution, right? And in that, a standard underhand serve in volleyball, that's what we see, right? So imagine we have a state space where we have the possible solutions we could use. If we put what our shoulders doing, what our elbows doing, and what our wrist is doing, all the possible combinations of those is the degrees of freedom problem, right? What do I do? What do I do? And freezing is basically the idea that what we're going to do, and if you have watching this video, you see the image, the person is serving basically by doing a full rotation around their shoulder joint and keeping their wrist and elbow locked, right? So they've chosen a coordination solution in state space that gets the ball over the net, right? But is by eliminating some of the degrees of freedom, right? We're taking the elbow out of the solution. It's not doing anything. It's staying locked, right? So that's Bernstein's type 1 freezing, where we lock joints, we don't use them in a solution. Okay. His second type of freezing is if I don't know what to do with my elbow, instead of locking it, why don't I just have it do the same thing the shoulder's doing? Right. So it's not taking the thing out of the equation by freezing it or locking it or not moving it. It's taking it out of the problem by just having it do the same thing as something else. Right. So I could use my elbow in the serve, but have it rotate at exactly the same rate and the same time as my shoulder, right? So I've simplified the degrees of freedom problem because I'm using one rule for two different things, right? So I don't need to separately decide what my shoulder's doing and what my elbow's doing, right? And here's an example in volleyball. You could do a serve where you rotate around your shoulder and your elbow and have them unfold at exactly the same time, right? So again, now in state space, the solution space, I've chosen a specific solution where in this case, what we call this rigid coupling, right? The coupling by meaning the shoulder and elbow are linked together, and rigid because it's not very functional coupling, right? They're doing the exact same thing together. Okay. So rigid coupling is the second type of solution. So usually this is temporary, right? Why is this good? Why is freezing either one of these good? Well, it's good because it solved the degrees of freedom problem, right? It solved the problem of choice for the new learner, and it's getting the ball over the net so he can start playing. I know I often say, if we required you to do a full jump serve before you could get on the volleyball court and start playing a game, people would be dropping out left and center, right? Because it would be too hard, right? You never get there. You'd lose motivation. You could never play, right? It would take you weeks and weeks before you could start playing the game. So it's getting you some proficiency so you can play. Why is it not good? Why can't we just stay with the freezing solution? Well, there's a few reasons, and some of these Bernstein's identified. First, it's not taking full advantage of external forces, right? So if we want to serve a volleyball at high velocity, obviously, if we're not incorporating some of the joints, we're not reaching the full potential of velocity we could get, right? That's why you do a jump serve. That's why you put all your joints in your lower body in it, because you're transferring all the forces from the ground into the ball, right? By pulling in all the degrees of freedom. If I did a jump serve with a locked elbow, I guarantee you there's no way I could hit it as hard as if I bend my elbow, right? Because I'm not using the kinetic chain effectively. The other thing is the solution is not going to be very adaptable, right? It's not going to be very resilient to having poor toss or opponents moving around or changing conditions or fatigue, right? If I just rotate my shoulder, I don't have very many options to adapt to changing conditions. And also, this is something we'll talk about later. I think there's real potential for injury, right? When you do this, because, it's very repetitive. You're using the same thing. Okay. So if you're going to be a skillful athlete and a skillful player, you need to move to the second stage of Bernstein stage, freeing. This is where we're going to move beyond locking and taking joints out of the equation by coupling them and bring them back in so we can have more adaptability, more power, and things like that, right? So whereas freezing is, either is very fixed solution within state space, right? Locking your elbow or rigid coupling. Freeing is when we start bringing things back in, right? So we're serving not just with our shoulder, but we're going to start rotating our elbow, maybe independently of our shoulder. And we're going to add wrist and hand motion. So if we look at our solution space, it's going to be a much bigger. We're going to use much more of the solution space, not just a single point within it where we're keeping things locked. And we're gonna have a much more advanced solution. We're going to free things. Okay. The last stage, so we started to free things. So we've brought in the elbow in the joint, elbow in the shoulder, for example, in serving a volleyball. We're letting them be free, giving us more power, more adaptability. But now we still have a problem. Like, how do we get them to work together, right? How do we get them on the same page? They can't just do anything they want, right? So the third stage, and one of the things that's kind of Turvey and Kelso have brought into this is the idea of coordinative structures. And I want to illustrate that with a volleyball jump serve, right? So now if we're going to bring everything back in, we've stopped freezing things. We're going to allow us to use all the joints. We're back to the degrees of freedom problem, right? What do we do with our shoulder and our elbow, right? And one of the main ways that we could do this is to, come up with a coordinative structure. And let me illustrate that again by comparing it to the traditional way, right? So the traditional view of how we coordinate our body parts in something like a jump serve and volleyball is we develop a motor program that specifies the parameter of each. So it tells how much arm rotation, how much wrist rotation, what angle, what degree. So we have this full program that specifies all the parameters beforehand, and we just execute it. And that leads to the idea of a repeatable swing. Okay. So what we need, what's the alternative, right? So what's the alternative? I think people realize that's very limited, right? So many parameters you would have to take into account. It doesn't make you very adaptable. So the other option, which is I call the Bernstein, Gibson, Lee, Turvey way, because it brings in this specific example, it brings in all the work. So what we need to do is pick up from the environment the constraints on the coordination solution. So what do I mean? What are the constraints? What do I mean by that, right? So when we have a volleyball, we've tossed up in the air to serve, right? It forms a visual angle on our eye, okay? And the rate of change of that visual angle, okay, that angle is going to be changing as the ball falls down towards us. Similarly, we have an angle that's created between our hand and the ball, which I call beta in this picture, right? And that angle is going to be changing as we move our arm, and we can sense that proprioceptively, right? So we have a constraint that we can impose on the situation, right? That the rate of change of the ball angle, which tells us how fast the ball's falling, has to equal the rate of change of our arm angle, which tells us the gap, how fast the gap between our hand and the ball is closing. If those two are equal, the hand's going to hit the ball, and they're going to arrive at the same time. So we created a simple constraint: the gap from the ball and the gap from our hand. If we make them equal, right, we've solved the timing problem. We don't need to say exactly what the shoulder's doing or the wrist's doing. All we need to do, right, is we need to create this constraint and let our body self-organize. So we've created a constraint, right? So if our our arm, the rate at which our arm is closing the gap to the ball is this angle beta. That angle is created by the combination of shoulder, elbow, and wrist joints, right? So how fast our hand gets to the ball depends on how fast our wrist, shoulder, and elbow are rotating. So all we have to do is create a constraint so that the combination of the shoulder rotation, elbow rotation, and wrist rotation is equal to the rate at which the ball is falling, the tau gap, right? So we've created this constraint on our movement, but within that, we can let the system self-organize, and it could do a bunch of different things. It could satisfy this constraint with all shoulder rotation, which is freezing type 1. It could satisfy it by making the shoulder and the elbow do the same thing, which is freezing type 2. Or we could use a lot of shoulder rotation, a little elbow rotation, a little wrist rotation, or a lot less shoulder, more elbow, more wrists, or go on and on and on. we have abundant solutions that we could use. All we have to do is make sure they satisfy the constraint that the sum of the shoulder, elbow, and wrist equals the gap created, the gap at which the ball is closing, the visual gap, right? So we've created this crazy constraint and we've let the system self-organize, okay? So a coordinative structure, this is what we mean by a coordinative structure. It's a linkage between the body segments, the joints in this case, that is constrained to be a functional unit, okay? So we're writing this equation of constraint over it, okay? Within it, though, the system self-organizes on its own, the specifics of it. So we're saying, in this case, your shoulder plus elbow plus wrist has to equal the gap, rate of closure with the ball. Whatever the values within that are, you self-organize and choose your own, okay? Why is this better? Why is this better than programming, right? Well, what we've done is we've taken the degrees of freedom problem. What solution can I do that will work? So the degrees of freedom problem for a new learner is what combination of shoulder, elbow, and wrist angles can I use to get the ball over the net? There's almost an infinite number of choices. A lot of them are not going to work, right? Most of them are not going to work. Most of the combinations, you have to come out with a small set. So that's the fundamental degree of freedom problem. You have all this choice. Most of the choices won't work. When we use a coordinative structure, we write a equation of constraint of our movement. What we do is create a situation where we have a lot of choices, right? All the possible combinations of shoulder, elbow, and wrist that all will work, right? By definition, if we meet that constraint, that rule, all of those solutions work, right? So we've created a problem of, we've gone from degrees of freedom problem to one of what we call degeneracy or abundance, having lots of different solutions, all of which will work, right? Which is a good advantage. The other thing we can do is we can get adaptability by having not rigid coupling, but compensatory functional coupling. So imagine we throw the ball up in the air, we're jumping to serve, and the gust of wind blows it down, right? So we've already started our shoulder rotation. And if we didn't do anything else, our hand is going to get there too late because the gap at which the ball is closing is faster than we thought it was when we started rotating our shoulder. Well, we can easily compensate for that by making the elbow and wrist rotate at faster rates, right, to close that gap faster. Similarly, if you accidentally throw the ball too high and the gap's closing slower than you expected, after you start rotating your shoulder, you can compensate that by using less elbow and wrist, right? So we have this coupling linking between the joints, but it's functional, right? They're compensating for each other to satisfy this constraint and get the hand to the ball at the same time. Same applies for fatigue. If we get fatigue in our shoulder, we can compensate for it by elbow and wrist rotation without having to exactly specify each of these things, right? It's happening online in the moment, right? So that's the idea of a coordinative structure. And the idea of this functional variability brings up another term you'll hear sometimes called motor synergy. So motor synergy is where the components of the system, your shoulder and elbow, work together in synergy to keep achieving your goal, okay? And the key point here is we're achieving outcome consistency, consistently getting our hand to the ball at the right place at the right time, but not by consistently moving the same way, right? Not repeatable arm swing. The shoulder, wrist, and elbow are doing different things slightly each time, right, to achieve our goal, right? So that's the kind of idea, right? And to end off this first part, what I want to do is kind of bring in some movement findings from research on volleyball that I think are very consistent with this alternative view of skill, right? This alternative view of repetition without repetition and the importance of movement variability. The first one is one that I'll revisit later too, is a really interesting one by Davids and colleagues looking at volleyball. Okay. What they did was to look at the how much things were varying during different parts of the serve, right? So what they did was to look at how variable is your, the toss, how when you start your toss, how variable is your initial movement of your elbow, initial movement of your shoulder, how variable is your elbow swing, how variable is your hand at the point of contact. And what they found is this classic finding that we get in a lot of motor control. I find it in my baseball research all the time. We call the funnel of variability. And what that is variability is going down and down and down as the movement progresses. So people, the time at which they take off from the ground is less consistent than the time at which their hand reaches the ball, what their hand is doing, right? So the variability is going down. We're getting more precise as the movement is unfolding. Then there's the exact values they found there. Such a thing is absolutely impossible with a motor program, right? A motor program is like a ballistic missile, right? Is like a cannonball, right? You shoot a cannon. You can't make a cannonball be more accurate after it's launched, right? That's what we're seeing. You're really inaccurate and inconsistent at the start of your movement. You're highly consistent at the end. That's impossible with a pre-programmed movement. You need to be adjusting on the fly using a ballistic thing like a ballistic missile, using this compensated variability, elbow and shoulder working together. So the reason our variability goes down at the point of contact is because our shoulder rotation is related to our elbow. Our elbow, the amount of elbow depends on the amount of shoulder that happened on that specific serve, right? So that's why we get this kind of variability. So I think that's very consistent. And I'll return to this study in a little bit. Another one I really like is an older one in the 1997 by Tim Prado and colleagues that looked at interlimb coordination between volleyball players of different skill levels. So they look at they took had 20 participants, 6 experts, and 10 from French national team, 10 undergrads who'd never really played volleyball, and they were asked to learn overhand serves, and they tracked their motion. And basically, what they were looking at was the relationships between what the joints are doing, right? And what's called a cross correlation. And remember, one of Bernstein's freezing types is when the two joints are doing the exact same thing. So when two joints do the exact same thing, we should expect a very high correlation, right? When my shoulder is rotating at the same amount as my elbow, we should expect a high correlation between them. So they did the study, and what they found was very different patterns in when they looked at kind of the different phases of the thing and what the shoulder and elbow were doing. They found that novices had a much higher correlations, right, between the joints. So evidence they were freezing and locking things. Whereas experts were using different patterns of elbow, shoulder, and wrist, right? They were freed up. They were doing different things, right? So experts weren't doing the exact same thing every time. They had variability in their movement, but they were doing it. They were not locking it, okay? They also found, so this is an example of the correlation or the coupling. If you look at for example, the shoulder elbow, the correlation coefficient between the shoulder and elbow in novices is 0.7, right? So they're very, very similar what they're doing, the shoulder and elbow. In expert, it's 0.2, right? So they're doing very independent things, right? They're not doing the exact same rotation, the same expert. They're freeing degrees of freedom. The other thing you see, and that really interesting in their study, is you look at experts. If you look at the plot of their, so these are plots of the solution space we saw earlier of their shoulder versus elbow, what they're doing, you can see that novice solution is very, very constrained. It's very not covering much of the possibility, whereas the experts are using much more of the available solution space, right? So I think a lot of these patterns of coordination, the difference you see at skill level is consistent with Bernstein's ideas, consistent with the idea of repetition without repetition. Things are varying. They're not doing the exact same thing every time. Okay, so that's all I want to do for this first part of the presentation. Next time, as I said, we'll get into more research and talk more specifically about how we can apply these ideas to practice design and coaching in volleyball. Thank you.